I grew up in a small town to a middle-class family at the very end of West Pine Street. The street was infamous to the town's lore. All across the road were large ran-down medical buildings. The medical facilities were frequently used in the 1940s at the height of lobotomy operations. I'd always heard accounts from older neighbors and people around the town about what used to happen in the buildings. Tales of spikes being driven into the brains of those who were mentally disturbed. Truly some spine-shivering accounts. The businesses that surrounded the mental health ward were all forced to close from odd circumstances over the years. The remaining land stayed undeveloped, and the buildings that were still standing, no one dared to touch. I went out to check the mailbox one morning, and when I made it down to the end of the driveway, I saw construction vehicles at one of the old abandoned buildings down the street. At first I didn't give it a second thought, but after getting back inside and sorting my mail, I made a comment about it to my father, who was just getting up. When I told my dad about the potential business in the area, he let out a long sigh. He immediately interjected with, "They don't know what they're getting themselves into." I'd only ever heard stories about the place and asked my dad if we should warn them. He agreed, wanting to at least give the people there a fair shake as to what they might unearth. We put our jackets on and began walking down the street towards the workers. After trotting halfway down the road, a police car and ambulance passed us along the way. I look at my dad, whose eyes are numb to it all. We both didn't make a sound. After arriving, we found out that part of the second floor had collapsed onto one of the workers. His body was being loaded up into the ambulance as the rest of the workers sat along their trucks, eyes wide, shocked to lose one of their fellow labormen. The policeman was in the middle of a long explanation about how dangerous the location is and how they never should have been given a permit to come out here in the first place. The officer locked eyes with my dad and said, "Mr. Hunt, I'm afraid there's been another situation here today." My dad had a noticeable repertoire with the policeman, and judging from the context of their words, it wasn't necessarily a positive one. My dad interjected and took over the conversation. He explained some history about the place and warned the workers that the land was haunted. The man in charge of the workers wasn't satisfied with my father's explanation, citing that the building had been left standing for so long without being properly maintained, that the fallen worker hadn't adequately inspected his zone, an oversight that was blamed on his death. My dad looked up at the police officer, eyebrows raised high, and awaited a response. The cop turned back to the workers and asked to see their papers. The foreman produced a writ that had been signed by city council allowing for the work on the property. "This new mayor might be getting you boys into some trouble," the policeman firmly said. The ambulance pulled out of the driveway, and he wished them well. The cop car pulled out as the rest of the workers stood around their vehicles, now shaken and noticeably bothered with fear. "I'm not going back in there," one of the larger workers said. "You heard him, that place is haunted. I even told Taylor I had a funny feeling when we pulled up." My father once more warned the men about continuing, that the place should have never been approved for work, that this is the kind of thing that has happened in the past, many, many times. We all heard a vague squeaking sound coming from behind us. Everyone turned at seemingly the same time and peered into the empty lot across the street. A shopping cart was slowly moving in perfect circles, making a rusted squeaking sound at every full rotation. I was shaken up before from seeing the corpse on the gurney, but this made my entire body shiver. The larger laborer who had spoken before, along with a couple other men, immediately got into their trucks and left. Listen, whoever's paying you guys clearly doesn't care about your safety, my dad said. But you've been warned. My father and I started walking away as the foreman scoffed and returned alongside the building. The other workers fell in, resuming their duties. "Watch out!" I heard the shout over my shoulder. My dad grabbed my neck and pulled me over to the side. We turned around as some kind of metal rod fell from the top of the building. It hit the foreman, piercing his hard hat and going straight through the length of his body. The initial impact echoed into a violent popping sound as waves of blood ejected out of his mouth. The moment the steel rod went through his body and hit the ground, it firmly embedded in the soil, and the foreman's limbs went limp. His workers stumbled and fell into the mud, shrieking and screaming as they struggled to get away. Profanities and prayers to God rang out from the chaos. "Let's get to the road, guys. It's not safe here," my dad yelled out in a commanding shout. We sat at the curb on the side of the road and waited on help to arrive. When everyone got settled, I noticed the shopping cart wasn't in the empty lot anymore. I didn't want to say anything, but when I saw one of the workers look up and start shaking, I knew I wasn't the only person that had noticed. After another ambulance arrived and my father gave a statement, we decided to leave. We started walking back down the street. I was a nervous wreck. My father told me how my grandmother was a nurse there in the 1940s, how she helped get the place shut down, witnessing hundreds of savage lobotomies, sometimes simply to correct an unruly patient's behavioral issues, something that nowadays we'd be able to treat with medicine. My grandmother's search for peace on behalf of the victims was the only reason we'd been allowed to live on that road. The wasted memories of the forgotten find solace in those buildings, a place where the death of the memory came before the death of the patient.